Good evening, YouTube, and welcome to 8:30 Prep. I'm David Cerniglia. In my absence is Mr. Phil McCaffrey. I'll be here with you tonight solo. Phil is going to be watching, and I'm sure making snarky comments from the comfort of his own home. I wanted the opportunity to be able to spread out a little bit and be able to talk to everyone in a little bit more detail about college essays and what the final product can potentially look like. I got to watch online last night and do a little bit of commenting myself. Learned a couple of things that I hadn't heard before, reinforced a lot of things that we have heard before, such as cautions about the mission trip essay and that sort of thing. What I'm going to do tonight is talk you through a couple of examples of some good college essays that we've seen in the past. I'm going to go through, in broad strokes, two different previous students' essays of ours. One who is a student at Columbia, another one who's at a private liberal arts school in Southern California. The first one, I'm going to show you the completed product from that student, and then I'm going to show you an initial draft and then a revision by a second student, just to get a sense of what a little bit of editing and a little bit of refocusing really is more than editing, to take a look at some essays. So let's take a look at how many people do we have on, Damien?
5 currently.
5, that's great. I think that's double what we had on Monday night. Maybe Mondays are just a little bit rough. Okay, so before we get started, talk about a couple of things before we get into the specifics of the few essays that I want to talk about tonight. One is, and this is important, and I'm going to show you a revision that actually did the opposite of this, that we're not trying to be absolutely unique or come up with the best possible story or the most exciting thing that's happened to you. Those often don't make the best stories. If it was something that led to a learning experience, for sure, but don't necessarily tell the story just for the story's sake. What college admissions people are trying to figure out is who you are as a person. They want to get to know you a little bit. How well are you going to fit on campus with the other students who are there? What's motivating you to learn the things that you want to learn? So it's not always the big great story with the surprise ending. Sometimes it's really just the mundane story told really well that gives a little bit of insight into who you are as a person. And remember, when we're talking about these essays, typically the longest they are about the length of the Common App essay, which is about 650 words. Additional essays are typically even shorter than that. So let's go ahead and take a look at an essay. I'll give you a little bit of background on this student, and then we can start taking a look through her essay. Female student, went to a school just outside of Pittsburgh, applied to a great many schools, 22 or 23, if memory serves me correctly. No, Phil, I'm not going to mention her name. I've asked the students permission to use these essays as examples, but I've also changed some of the details in these essays so that there's no identifying information, or that in some cases there's misidentifying information. In any case, both of these students are just about done with college in any case. So if we take a look at the first essay, I just want to look through the first paragraph a little bit and point a couple of things out, or really look through the first paragraph, which is these two sentences here. I sit down on the left side, 15 rows from the front, hoping that the undergraduate students don't ask me to leave. So this is and again, this is something that we got to in a revision of this essay. This isn't what it looked like in the first draft, but we're capturing the reader's attention, but in a relevant way. It's making them want to read a little bit more. Again, we don't really need fireworks or lots of intrigue at the beginning, but this certainly asks the reader to go on and read a little bit more. A person walks to the front and says, "Welcome to the University of Pittsburgh's mini course on Muslims in America." So now we start to get a little bit of context. So the student goes on to explain her experience about presenting a paper at an academic conference as a high school student. And then down here in the third paragraph gets to something that I think that a lot of people miss, which is really getting to the why. Why are you writing about this? Why is this important to you? Why is this something that you want to take the time to write? And why is this something that an admissions officer should take the time to read? So she's talking about studying Islam, and she said that her interest in Islam ironically emerged from my own faith in Catholicism. So she goes on to tell a story down here about being a younger child in middle school and her grandmother not being as open-minded about a friend of hers who was Muslim, and that's really what led her her interest into world religions, international politics, and things like that. So she's getting to a broader point about what her academic interests are by telling a little bit of a personal story. So it doesn't stay with the stories about childhood, but moves on and talks about how her interests expanded as she moved through high school, and then on to college. So just a pretty simple example, very well written essay. Structurally, it's really, really good. There's some very, very good specific examples. People and these essays, usually in their initial drafts, make one of two mistakes, which is either they err too much towards the broad or too much towards the concrete. So the goal is, as you're writing and revising and editing and having people read for you, you can find a balance between really broad generalizations and the sort of specific stories that make it interesting. So what I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about next is an essay that a student came into me with. She had applied to a very selective university, early decision, and she didn't get in. So she came in with her application materials and her essays and asked me to look at them. So when we looked at the other things that college admissions officers take into account when they're looking at your application, things like grades, test scores, all of those things looked really good. Now, certainly with the selective university, you can have the grades, the test scores, and your essays can be fantastic, and just not everyone gets in. But when I read this essay, the first thing that struck me was what a great essay it was. It was really, really well written. It was actually a lot of fun to read, but I could see some problems with it, I think, below the surface that were a little bit tougher for this person to see and for some of her earlier readers to see. So I'll just walk you through a little bit of this. And reading probably doesn't make for very good television either, but writing instructing doesn't necessarily make for the best television in the first place. And I'm not going to try to pronounce this because it's German. I stride past the majestic, Damien, German. Do you read German?
No, but
Lorenzersche, I think it's Zersche, Lorenzersche, into the winding cobblestone streets, admiring traditional timber-framed buildings and modern shops while inhaling the occasional waft of deliciousness from eateries along the way. Super well written, really descriptive, very literary. This happened to be this student's kind of natural tone when she wrote. I would go for whatever tone works well for you. The sun sinks as the city lights wink on. I hurry along, aware of the streets radiating out around me, and realize that in my fascination, I've lost my way. I must find the Rothenplatz, the subway station that will bring me to my new neighborhood. Okay, so just like the first essay, we have this sort of, you're being drawn in, stumbling over, excuse me, that first word that's in German actually probably helps to bring me in a little bit, whereas this, I happen to know that it's the name of a German town, as we'll get to see. So the student goes on to write about this really meaningful trip that she took to Germany, and sort of her fascination with German culture. Then when we get down here a little bit later, there's a point at which she loses her way, and she writes, stopping for a breath, I compose myself. She's lost in a country where she doesn't speak the language. Hold on a minute, it's okay. My thoughts float to my younger self when my brother was diagnosed with a rare cancer. During his treatment, we moved to Cleveland, and she goes on. There's nothing inherently wrong with writing something like this, but what happens is the essay starts to veer off course a little bit, becomes less about her and a little bit more about her brother and what her family went through. As we move towards the end of the essay, when we kind of get to the culmination of the essay, she's lost and eventually finds her way. She writes, as the train glides homeward, I know I'll master my way around the city. I can't wait to explore whatever familiar territory I might encounter next. Great essay, interesting story about a trip abroad, just not enough about her as a person. There wasn't really enough I didn't feel like I got to know her. I didn't feel like I learned anything about her. So after a couple of weeks of going back and forth with revisions, she came up with something that really took what seemed to be the thrust of the story about this trip that she took, going to a country where she'd never been, trying to speak a language that she really couldn't speak very well. And that story fell away completely, And it ended up being a story about how she loved German culture because her father's from Germany, and about how her grandmother spoke mostly German and she couldn't really communicate with her grandmother. So this became a much more intimate essay. I felt like I got to know her. I learned something about her a little bit. And one of the things that we get here is that we get that though one of her parents spoke German, they didn't really speak German around the house. So when she decided that she wanted to learn German to connect with her heritage, she actually went off and learned it on her own, even though her school didn't offer German as a world language. So we ended up with a much more personal, much more intimate essay. Looking at essays like the ones that we've just looked at, it's important to remember that these are a culmination of an enormous amount of work. There was a lot of planning that went into this. There were a lot of missteps. There were a lot of places. This failed, especially with this student who had spent an enormous amount of time writing a really beautifully structured, really beautifully written essay that really only missed its mark because it wasn't doing that really specific thing that the college essay is really meant to do, which is to reveal something about you as a person. It certainly doesn't have to be something that you wouldn't openly or readily admit to someone else, but allowing the admissions people a little bit of insight to see who you are as a person and what makes you tick. One of my favorite exercises back in the old days when I was a high school teacher, I taught high school English at a local private school in Pittsburgh. And I taught juniors for the most part. And just about this point at the end of the junior year, late April, early May, I would have my students read a long short story by Herman Melville, who's also the author of Moby Dick. And the story is called Bartleby the Scrivener. Some of you who are maybe know Melville a little bit less, but know movies a little bit more, will know the movie Office Space, written by Damien, Matt Judge. Thank you. Office Space is Matt Judge, the developer of Beavis and Butthead. Office Space is actually based on that Herman Melville story, Bartleby the Scrivener. So the story about Bartleby is that he works in a law office. He's worked there for a long time, and he comes to a realization one day that he's doing all of these things that he really just doesn't like to do. He's doing things at work he doesn't like to do. He goes home and has to pay bills and do other things he doesn't want to do. So one day he just decides to stop. And what he says every time someone asks him to do something that he doesn't want to do is he says, "I would prefer not to." So his boss comes to his office and says, "Bartleby, we need these documents on the table by the end of the day." And he just looks at him calmly and says, "I would prefer not to." So it's this really odd kind of enigmatic story about this guy who just starts saying, and it's important, not saying no, just saying, "I would prefer not to," and then refusing. So they would finish this and then say, "Why did you make me read this?" Which is what English teachers hear all the time. And the reason is that what the Bartleby story gets to is getting to the why about what gets you out of bed in the morning, really what makes you tick. What are the things that drive you? What are the things that you're shooting for? Is it your relationships that are important to you, the relationships with your family? Are there intellectual interests that you have? It certainly doesn't have to be academic or related to school in any real way. What are the things that pique your interest, that get you excited, whether it's sports, music, doing something creative, whatever it happens to be. So getting to those small details, those stories that give an insight into who you are as a person, are really the most vital things. But again, remember that this is a process. Ideally, if you're a junior, this is the perfect time to start thinking about this stuff. As I've mentioned about, I think 5 of you probably heard this on Monday, to start thinking about your essays. Collect the essays together, the supplements from the various schools to which you think you'll be applying. Look at the common application essay. Look at essays from schools that you're applying to that may not require the common application. There are some other sort of standardized applications out in the universe as well, like the coalition application as well. Many of them are really similar, but the focuses tend to be a little bit different, and the word limit tends to be a little bit different too, which is going to make a difference. Okay, so comments or questions? How many people do we have on, Damien?
Still 5.
What are we looking at? Just 5? Do we have any comments or questions from the 5 that we have out here? Anything coming up in chat? Who's here?
Phil questioned your calling him snarky.
Phil? That's because I can talk about him and he's not here.
That's right.
By the time he gets here, I'll be able to run home. So that will be okay. Some of the favorite, I think some of the favorite essays that we've seen, I think have probably been the ones that were the least surprising. They weren't the ones that were about the student who tried to get his pilot's license, though we've certainly had good ones about that. But often where there's a conflict in context. I was going to mention this on Tuesday night when we talked about this. But if a student came to me, given no other context, and said, "Hey Dave," or "Hey Phil, I want to write my college essay about all the time that I spend playing video games." Without any context, I would probably say, maybe not the best idea. Phil and I had a student last year who had a wildly successful essay about the time she spent playing video games because she was a hardcore straight A student at the top of her class, and she tended to be really, really anxious, and the way that she let off steam was to play Call of Duty and World of Warcraft. So it was really sort of a contrast to the other things that happen in her application. Certainly if you spend a lot of your time slacking off and your grades, test scores, and letters of recommendation vouch for that, writing an essay about how much time you spend playing Fortnite is probably not going to be the best strategy. The most important thing, again, is really, really to start thinking about this stuff so that it's always kind of in the back of your mind, that it's sort of marinating there. So when it's time to come and get things out on paper, you have some raw materials to work with. In terms of timeline, and I don't know if they talked about this I can't remember if they talked about this last night in terms of timeline. Generally speaking, the earliest your applications are going to be due will be November. I think I mentioned that earlier in the week. Regular decision applications are usually due late December, early January. These essays tend to be more time consuming than people think. So if you can have really, really good solid drafts or pretty solid drafts done by the end of August, you'll be in pretty good shape to spend a little bit of the fall doing some revising. I would not, under any circumstances, wait to start working on these things until the school year starts. If and when the school year starts, or the way in which the school year will start. Okay, do we have anything else in chat? Does Phil want to say anything else?
I don't think so. There'll be like a 20-second delay if he does.
There will be a 20-second delay. That's okay. Okay. The best bet for the 5 of you who are on here, whoever is on, come and schedule an appointment with me or with Phil so that we can come in and start talking about these essays. It's never too early, again, to just get started thinking about these things. Okay, is that it?
Yeah, sure.
All right, guys, start thinking about your essays, and we'll see you. When's the next time we're on? Monday, that's right, because it's Thursday. Phil will be back on Monday. Have a great weekend, everybody.